Okay, excellent. In that case, I would like to start with saying welcome to everyone who is participating in this session of the interest group for surveying open data practices at this virtual plenary in Costa Rica, where we would have liked to be. I welcome you on behalf of David O'Brien, Federica Rossetti, Louise Bezuidenhout, Thomas Hervé, and Anelda van der Walt, who have been participating in the work in this interest group in the last last year actually. And we got an excuse from our co-chair, Kaz Hayashi, our Japanese co-chair, who is too much engaged in COVID-19 issues in his country. This is the outline of our session, which will last 90 minutes. I will do the very short introductions and do some context setting. Then David will take over and he will present a framework for open data surveys, which we have been working on in the last years. And then Louise and her team will tell you all about their standardized survey instrument and what it will look like and how it's been developed. And then after that, we will have a facilitated discussion because we think that there are reasons to believe that we have to hand over our work to someone else because we are not sure that our interest group will be the best place to host a standardized survey instrument, but that is for later to discuss. Maybe I'll first like to go to the background of this interest group, which started actually before the plenary in Montreal, where CWTS, where I'm working in the Netherlands, and Elsevier set out to do a survey, a large survey to assess, try to assess the implementation of data sharing practices following the strong attention that has been paid to that open data work. And we found that there were various survey reports to do exactly the same with slightly different questions, other audiences, other coverage, and we thought that it is in so much interest of all of us, not only the RDA community, but also policymakers, funders, countries, publishers, that everybody would benefit from something that is an open data survey approach that could be adopted and implemented to track changes over time for all of us. So that we could be able to compare and benchmark advances that are going to take place. So the objectives of the IG, which kicked off at the 10th RDA plenary, was to convene with user communities to develop a community-designed modular and interoperable open survey or surveys, and to determine how such open surveys could be implemented and used. This was being discussed in several of the plenaries in Botswana, in Helsinki, and also actually we would like to come to a close in this plenary. So Convene user communities. This is all about participation and perspectives of the different kinds of users and to promote the dialogue among these users and also among the questionnaire designers. What should be in, what shouldn't be in, what could be told, what changes are analyzed, and what does all this surveying tell us? So there are different perspectives because different the policymakers, funders, countries have different ideas of what they want to track. And so what we did over these different set of plenaries to present use cases from the publishers, the one we did with Elsevier, but also the Spring and Nature ones, the State of Open Data, the Wiley ones. We presented very interesting studies from Japan and from Austria who implemented these surveys into their national policy analysis, and we explored how the geographical needs of these surveys were covered or not. And also we reached out to other RDA interest groups and working groups and tried to get them to use the type of surveys and modular elements that we set out to develop. And last but not least, we had the funders. We have discussed things with the funders, both in a national context, but also in the context of the RDA. And this is something that we will discuss later as well. Then the second objective was to develop a community design, modular and interoperable open survey. We have done extensive horizon scanning, which was compiled and will be presented very condensed by David, but all the information is in the paper, in which we looked at how these questions could be compared or could not be compared, and how difficult it is to get a sense of the results and comparability of the results. We also engaged with Elias Zaslavsky from San Diego. He presented us in Botswana with a survey analysis tool via visual exploration, the SUAVE tool, where you can upload existing surveys and which provides an online system to make and visualize the results of such surveys. And then we set out to develop surveys and survey models, which was done by Louise. And one of the other things that we had to take on board was to address language and cultural differences, because not all the grounds are common in the different parts of the world. And we paid particular attention to the African context there. Then the last part of last set of the objectives is to determine how such open surveys could be implemented and results analyzed globally. And that is something that we would like to discuss today. We have developed a technical tool that could be the solution for our purpose. And what we need to decide today is what are the multiplying networks to deploy such surveys, and how can we reach out to the different societies that could use our work, and how to make and where to make the modular surveys freely available, and how we could promote that work. And also to extend beyond the organizations and stakeholders that are currently not tracking the developments in data sharing. So this is basically what we want to discuss today, after we have presented the progress that we made in the last 3 years. So I think that is the introduction that I wanted to give, starting. I have to stop sharing. And then I'm back. And then I can hand over to David, who will present then the framework that we developed. But first I have to welcome also our panel members, which I forgot to do in the introduction. I did introduce our teams, but I should have also introduced our panel members. I don't know whether they're all there, but I have seen Dimitris Koreas, who is there. And I've also, I'm not sure, but I have whether they are already there, but Matthew, Lucas and Seppo will be joining us later in the session as well. So without further ado, I will hand over now the word to David, and then we will engage in further in the further discussion on the work of this interest group. So David, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Ingeborg.
I will stop my video and mute my microphone now.
Well, I'm just going to ask people that have joined us whether or not there's any questions for clarification on your introduction. Ingeborg condensed kind of 4 sessions of RDA meetings and over a 2-year period of time in a short period of time. So please, everyone, if you have a question, please raise your hand or jump right in before I move on.
Yeah, you can put your questions in the chat, please, because we are too much people to see whether the mic is on. For all the others, I think it's good practice now to mute our mics and stop the videos when somebody is presenting. So that's exactly what I will do. I don't think that there are any questions. Also good to know that the majority of our presentations and results are can be obtained from our RDA group website where all the presentations are downloadable. Okay. So I think with that, David, I hand over to you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. My name is David O'Brien, and I've been joined in this working group for since the beginning, and I'm pleased to sort of present to you. Can you see my slides here, folks? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to jump into a short conversation on a framework for open data surveys. I will not assume that people have attended our meetings in the past, but basically in our last meeting in Helsinki, we presented some survey results of a comparison of various surveys that are out there. And I will get to that in a bit, but one of the observations that we had from looking at surveys by publishers, by funders, by national agencies, by academics, was a question of their conceptual framework they were built. And so why are we interested in surveys? You know, and what can surveys tell us about researchers' practices, and also the impact of policies, services, infrastructures, and why practices might change. Our question is, you know, why, you know, can survey data be used to explain as well as describe? The survey data that's in does a very good job at telling us who's sharing data, what kind of data they're sharing, when they're sharing it, where they're depositing it, and how they're doing it. And if you, in this second column here, many of the surveys started when we started was a one survey and providing baseline data, a snapshot in time as to where certain disciplines or countries were at in their data sharing activities. And it was descriptive. And over the last 2 years that we've been involved in this IG, a number of the sponsors of surveys have launched second and even third surveys. So we're beginning to get trends over time. But the question we wanted to ask, and was not an explicit focus of ours, but when you get to ask the question why, you know, why are there differences in disciplines? Why are there differences across countries? What are the reasons for that? And then when you get to having some longitudinal data, what can we do to explain these trends? Why are there divergent patterns? Why are some research communities increasing data sharing while others are remaining stagnant, or perhaps others even declining? So this question of why gets to our point as to why we think it's important to have both a conceptual framework to base surveys on and to analyze the data. So are surveys using a conceptual framework or theory of change? This was a chart that was put into, that was in one of our working papers that are on our site, and it gives you a sense of the surveys that we're talking about here, or a selection of surveys that we looked at. So on the first column gives you a sense of the surveys that we looked at and their publishers. It gives you a sense of their titles, their focus, which years they were in, the size of these, and collectively, just in this group of 10, we're at about 25,000 observations. So stretched over 190 countries. So this could be quite powerful, particularly over time, to begin to look at these trends and explain those trends. But when we looked at these surveys, not only told us the who, what, when, and how, but when we wanted to say why, there was not much information on understanding what was grounding the choice of their questions and what their conceptual model was. So in thinking about how we might utilize survey data to model or for either policy purposes, we were looked for options to sort of build a conceptual framework. And one that I was familiar with and one that has been used to develop and explain institutional change and policy outcomes over time was work that Elinor Ostrom, of Nobel laureate, developed to explain collective action issues and policy outcomes. And this was called the Institution Analysis for Development Framework. And it gives you, a simple representation is here. And it basically says, if we want to get a sense to understand what outcomes are, or trends over time, or why certain disciplines or countries share more data, or et cetera, we not only have to look at the individuals who are doing this, but also the context that they're working in. And if you look at the number of surveys that we've looked at, you will find questions that ask the researchers about what infrastructure is available in their universities or in their countries. There are questions that ask on their community attributes about whether or not it is a norm within their community to share research data. There are questions in surveys that ask, did you share data because your funder required you to do so? Is it an institutional policy to share this? So there are a number of questions that speak to the context as well as to the actual choices that researchers make. And when we get to the surveys over time, we can begin to model the interaction and learning that occurs. There's questions that saying, have you in the past gained recognition for sharing of data? How has this changed your views, such and such? So this framework is, if applied to survey data, can help begin to get us at a sense of to ask the why questions. So this is one of the observations that we made, that we should begin to sort of develop this idea of a modular survey and do so that's sort of based in a conceptual framework. So that's the intervention I wanted to make, and I'm going to turn over to Louise now, who's going to outline the work that she and her colleagues have done in developing a survey instrument that's grounded within a framework such as this. So before I turn it over to Louise, is there any, actually, I'm going to pause here because I think once Louise gets into her discussion, you'll get a better sense of where we're at, and we'll take questions at the end of her before we launch into the roundtable. So thank you. Louise, over to you.
Thanks, David. My screen sharing fine? There we go. Is that fine for everyone?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, super. So hi, everyone. My name is Louise Verzetenhout, and I'm going to be reporting back on a project that I've been running with two other colleagues, Inalda van der Walt and Atoma Mboa. Basically, as David said, this project came about through the RDA interest group, obviously building on the work that they'd already done. What they had seen was that there were an increasing amount of surveys with questions relating to data sharing, but there was a high diversity and focus in topics and in question style and language that made it very difficult to compare between the surveys. And this meant that there was a huge amount of data that were being collected that were not interoperable. And this, obviously, as David said, there's an amazing amount of data points out there that are not necessarily being utilized properly. So as David said, what we were asked to do through the funding from the IDRC was to extend the work that the interest group had done to first look at the existing surveys, and then work towards a survey that could be that would be disseminated in Africa. So what Anelda, Thomas, and I have been doing over the last few months is first to utilize the framework that the interest group had set up, the Institutional Analysis and Development Framework, and then to populate it with the questions from the existing surveys. We've actually added a few more surveys to our analysis. And we wanted to break down the questions into the different subsections of the IAD framework. And what that enabled us to do was to compare the question styles and the question focus between the different surveys, and to find commonalities in wording that might allow for cross-comparison of questions. And this has led us to develop a question bank that cross-references to the existing surveys, that has over 100 questions that specifically interrogates the different areas, the sub-areas of the IAD. This larger question bank has been a very useful resource, because the way we're envisioning it is that that larger question bank will enable people to utilize the questions to disseminate surveys from subsections of questions identified from the question bank. The final list of questions that are in the question bank are subject to very specific design decisions. As much as possible, we try to keep them modular. Oh, sorry, I'm not talking about that. So the design decisions for the questions were specifically that there were no open-ended questions. This was going to be very important to facilitate cross-survey and cross-linguistic comparison. And that the survey questions themselves from the question bank would enable people to design modular surveys in response to specific needs or qualitative research, and to foreground specific areas in the IAD within data sharing institutions. The question bank is also independent of any survey tool, and we felt this was very important because it would allow flexibility for the reuse of the questions with relation to national and institutional requirements, in particular for Europe and the UK, survey tools that are GDPR compliant is a very important issue to consider. So what we then did from our question bank was to identify some questions that would form the basis of a survey for surveying data sharing practices in Africa. We were asked to conduct the survey in Africa in response to the IDRC Science Granting Council's initiative. And because of the activity in this area, we decided to disseminate the survey in 8 countries that were currently active in the SGCI initiative. We identified a subset of questions from our question bank that was based on prior qualitative research that really highlighted areas that had very little existing data. So particularly areas to do with research infrastructures, research context, and then also motivations for African researchers to share or not share their data. Because there are 3 main, well, there are many languages, but 3 main languages that are currently in use in African academia, we decided to translate the survey into French and Portuguese. And the survey is currently live at the link below, so you're more than welcome to take a look. And please do feel free to disseminate it to any colleagues you have in the countries listed. So now I'm going to hand over to Anelda, who is going to talk a bit more about the interoperability of the survey and the survey tool. Anelda, do you want to share the screen, or do you want me to keep?
No, I think if you can go with the slides, that would be great.
Okay, if you just tell me when to change.
Excellent, thanks. So good evening, everybody. I have the exciting task to tell you a little bit more about the technical details of how we are making the resources that we're creating in this project available to others for reuse, and also in terms of interoperability. So from what you've seen, what Louise discussed already, there's going to be a lot of outputs from this project. And many of those outputs will not be what we call traditional research outputs. For example, we have the website, which is a clonable website, which means anybody else can build exactly the same website, but populate with their own information. There will be the data, we've shared the ethics application form. We will share the analysis scripts and many other things that come along while we are doing this project. And what we're hoping to achieve with that is that others will not only be able to reuse the data, but will be able to replicate a project like this in any other context in another at another time as well. So for that reason, we are really looking at FAIRifying project outputs, which means we're trying to make them findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And as many of you who have run surveys before know, it's a timely and a costly experience or experiment thing to do. And why wouldn't we want to make everything that we create as easy as possible to reuse so that others can save time and costs? For the purpose of this talk, we're only focusing on the interoperability and the reusability of our resources. And when we look at interoperability, I realize that for various people, depending on which discipline you come from, interoperability might mean different things. But when we look at interoperability in this project, we were thinking about how can we create an interoperable data analysis for the English, the French, and the Portuguese surveys, which are distinct, separate surveys in the survey platform. How can we look at the data that we'll be collecting and combine that with data that might be generated in other contexts, not only in the 8 African countries that we're surveying this time, but in other African countries, other institutions, other continents. And then lastly, to look at interoperability over time. So we're running the survey 2020, hoping to finish the work on it in 2021, early 2021. But hopefully these questions will be reused in future surveys by the same people and other people. And how can we create an opportunity to make these data and assets available over time to be reused and make them interoperable. Okay, you can go to the next slide. In terms of reusability, we're really looking at what file formats we are making data and resources available. Are they open file formats? Are they accessible? Are they machine readable? Are they human readable? We are looking at making sure that we are licensing our resources appropriately to ensure that it can be reused legally. We were also looking at the survey platform that we're using. So for this project, we are using the DISC survey platform, but we realized that other projects might be using a variety of different survey tools. And what we're trying to do is to make sure that the questions are available so that you can either import them into a different survey or, if needs be, copy and paste. And then lastly, we have translated the survey and the website into French and Portuguese and are hoping that much of this will be it will be possible to reuse as is in other countries that are where these languages are prominent. Finally, what I wanted to share with you is that, last slide, please, that it's important to realize interoperability and reusability doesn't come for free and it doesn't come without skills. So if you are considering to run a project where you want to be sure that your data and resources are reusable, accessible, and interoperable, it really, really helps a lot if you can team up with someone who has the technical skills. I'm showing a few of the logos of the tools that we are using in this project. And to some of you, some of the tools might not look familiar. We are using R, which is, and what I want to stress here is that everything except for the survey platform are tools that are open and free to use. So in terms of costs for licensing and all of that, there are no other costs to run this project except for time, human time, and the survey platform. So we are going to be writing the scripts in R. We are doing some manipulation in Python through Jupyter Notebooks. We are using Twitter and Zenodo to share our resources, make it findable and accessible and reusable by applying the licenses that's available in Zenodo as well. Through GitHub, we are making the files available for people who would like to automate some of the processes and are technically more skilled. We're using a Hugo template for the website, which is free, and we're hosting it on GitHub, which is free. And we're making use of images that are in the public domain from Pixabay for the website as well. So as you can see, there really doesn't have to be much of an overhead in terms of the tools that you use, but you do need to consider technical skills and partnering with people who are familiar with some of these tools. Thanks, Louise.
Super, thanks, Imelda. Thomas, are you there?
Yes, I'm there, but I'm not able to. Okay, let me open my video. Okay, can you see me now?
Yes.
Can you see me now?
Yes, I think you're there, Imelda. You can see Thomas?
Yes, all good.
Okay, go for it, Thomas.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, I focus on the contribution of the open data and the survey tool we are using for advancing open science. First of all, it's important to explain or to share with you our perspective about open science, because sometimes people reduce open science to academia with scholarly communication, publication and research and something like that. But we have a three-dimensional approach of open science constituted of three-dimensional openness. The first one is openness to publication, and the second one is openness to society, and the third is openness to exclude knowledge and epistemology. So the question of when we are thinking about this survey is was to see how we can produce data, open data that can contribute to those three dimension of open science. So next. Yes, the first thing is that we can have fair data as findable, accessible, and interoperable and reusable data. But the first question in the table David present at the beginning, who is producing such data is very important also in order to contextualize and to adapt what we are doing. So because data can be findable and accessible, but if we are using data coming from another context to describe our own reality or the reality in Africa, I'm not sure that this data will be fair. So that is why I added this fair before in terms of trustful data and something like that, because so when we have such data, fair data, we are sure that we are going to produce contextualized research. So a kind of research with data coming from the inner, you are sure that you are going to allow academia or local researcher to produce research describing their own reality and the truth, if you want. And such research can be used to better inform national government about the decision on the policy they are going to set up in order to meet the needs of citizens, or to prioritize what they need for, even for innovation, for innovators. So because we are using open data, we are using open source and data set to develop new tools and apply them to our context. And sometimes these data are coming from different contexts which are not really which are not really aligned with our own reality. So, but fair data, like the one we are going to collect, we are collecting actually, able to can enable us to address such issue and help people get the reality of their context. And the third dimension of how open data can contribute to for advancing open science is about inclusion and cognitive justice, because when you have a kind of this loop between research, society, and citizen, you are sure that you are going to consider and to take in account each category of the society, like marginalized community and local researchers, because sometimes local researchers are neglected because they don't have this the same exposure of research abroad or in the diaspora when we are looking from Africa. So with this loop, it's not an hierarchical loop, but it's kind of it's not an hierarchical system, but it's a kind of bidirectional system where each of these dimensions can contribute to make contextualized research and to advance open science, because we trust that open science is the fair way to do science and to meet the needs of local community in Africa. And just to say, to finish with this slide, is to say that fair data are the building block of science. So we need to put a lot of energy in order to get real data and contextualized data from our context in Africa. Next. Yes, but the issue is that if you, from the database or the collection of data you use, you can consider, you can observe that a lot of these surveys are funded by external or international institutions. Few countries like South Africa or Egypt, or if you are talking only about sub-Saharan Africa, few countries are able to fund their own survey. But it's very important to put an eyes and to put energy on collecting data. So by building kind of these reusable survey tools, we are able to give different countries across Africa the possibility to reproduce or to conduct survey according to their need and to remix it as they want. And we are making effort because, as Adela said, it's not free, but we are going to make effort to bring the margin here to zero so that people can really reuse it. And also, when we have this kind of a robust survey, we have chance that this survey can be collectively improved because question can come from each context, because Africa is not a country, it's not one country, it's many countries, and each context country can bring a new insight in the survey, and we can make our survey stronger and stronger with time. Also, the idea behind building a robust Pan-African data set can be used to have a clear picture in terms of knowledge ecology from the African perspective, from the African continent, and facilitate comparison, and also to avoid biases, so that you can better catch some biases and see how you can address them. And now that we are talking about machine learning and artificial intelligence, a lot of artificial intelligence application working with data available on internet. So we need to produce, it's important to produce data coming from our context in such a way that we can use, or we can take advantage of responsible AI. So that is why for me or for us in the group, this reusable survey tools is very important, and we will be very happy to have a lot of contribution or to see this idea grow. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, so just to end off, obviously, as you can hear from the way Anelda, Thomas, and I are describing it, we're very excited about the work that we've done, and we're very grateful to the IDRC and the interest group for giving us the opportunity to do this work. Obviously, this is just the first step in what we're hoping will be a much longer journey towards getting interoperable surveying and getting surveying done in areas that are currently under-surveyed. We think future steps, not only for the survey tools, but also the question bank, would be to engage with funders and research institutions to assess whether the survey is useful as a resource for capacity building and research support. We'd like to promote the use of the question bank and the surveying tools, both within Africa and also more broadly. We would like to have support for evaluation and to help it evolve as a dynamic resource, or a set of dynamic resources. We'd like to create a system for further questions and translations to be added to the big question bank. We'd like to create a simple data tracking process to support future surveying and to ensure that the reuse of the survey actually contributes data that can be compared. And we'd like to support future survey initiatives, and particularly in under-surveyed research communities, such as Africa and South America. And I think Thomas has given a very compelling justification as to why that is important for advancing open science in these regions. So that's all I've got to say on my part. Thanks very much, and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Anelda, Louise, and Thomas. That was excellent. We're about to make a shift between the work that we have done to a bit more of a forward-looking discussion. And before we make that shift, I'd like to ask those who are online with us if they have any questions on any of the presentations or any other related question that you'd like to ask us. So if so, just unmute yourself and ask your question. That would be great. No.
I had a question about bias in the surveys, especially when we are surveying and asking people to self-report certain behaviors. So I'm wondering how to address social desirability bias in these surveys. And it makes me think, because a lot of people say, yes, I do support open data and I do want to share, but then we look at the numbers and people aren't sharing. So there's that discrepancy. So I wonder if there's a way to address that. Thanks.
Anybody want to tackle that, Louise?
I don't have any particular, final answers for that. But I think when we were analyzing the surveys, there is obviously a big problem. And a lot of them ask aspirational questions about what are your motivations and what do you think is important. And it became apparent then obviously you're going to get the ideal real gap when you're coming to survey aspirations versus actual practices. So what we have done with our question bank is try to focus questioning on practical actions and barriers rather than motivations. and then to ask questions more about what would motivate you in the future to change practices rather than asking about value-based decisions in situ. We're hoping that in some way allows some flexibility to overcome that, but I think there is always a problem with surveying. See, Tomasco, it's, yeah.
Yes, the one way to avoid survey, to avoid biases in survey, we can tackle this since the design of the survey. And in terms of design, if you remember, Louise, we have this issue about quantitative question and qualitative question. So it's true that when you are running a global survey and you want to touch many countries in different continents, I'm sure that you are going to drive a lot of bias like that, because a lot of such survey use quantitative question. So during the design, you need to allow this kind of a lot of open-ended question. It's a lot of work to do qualitative analysis, and also you need to change maybe the standpoint from where you are designing the question. So because you can design a question or some survey based on the assumption that people have all the same condition everywhere. Why in Africa, a lot of countries are still dealing with the third industrial revolution issue. In some other part of the world, they are already in the fourth revolution, industrial revolution. So these contextual challenges also can be fixed. So I think it's a lot of work in terms of qualitative question, in terms of the design, and also the epistemological approach you have, because you have to consider the standpoint of people who are going to fill this survey. So that is what I can say.
Thank you, Thomas. We have one other question, and then we're going to switch gears here. A practical question on how do you incentivize people to answer? Good question. Some of the publishers that we've spoken with offer a random prize, a book prize, or a contribution to a charity to help incentivize individuals to respond. We've also heard from a presentation in Japan and in Austria, where they had a representative sample across the country, where people understood what the purpose of the survey was in terms of design new services and programs for open science, and the research community felt that this was a valid reason in which to contribute, and they were able to get a really significant response. Very quickly, anybody else wishing to chime in on this point?
I just wanted to say, in terms of the survey we're currently running in Africa, obviously, definitely incentivizing people to participate is always useful, but it was very impractical for us, and we are not incentivizing our participants for two main reasons. The first is that trying to provide incentivizations that mean something across 8 different countries with very different infrastructures, some of which do not even have things like Amazon delivery, was very difficult to identify anything that would be worth using. And the second was, during COVID, it was very difficult to even think about trying to get some in-country opportunities going. So yeah, if anyone had any ideas of how we could have done it differently, I would love to hear them, because it has been very challenging.
Thanks, Louise. Okay, colleagues, I want to switch gears here to the discussion session. I'd like to ask if Seppo, Dimitris, and Matthew could sort of turn on their video for us. This was an open meeting, but we wanted to ask a couple of leading questions from some individuals to guide us moving forward. So we've asked Matthew Lucas, wearing his hat as a co-chair of the RDA Funders Forum. We've asked Demetrius Kurias as our technical advisory board liaison. And we've asked Seppo Hashigonta with his hat from the African Open Science Platform. So welcome. Thanks for joining us and helping us sort of think about next steps. As you heard in Ingeborg's introduction, we were an interest group that was set up a couple of years ago. And we felt that we've addressed the questions that we set out to do. And now that we're addressed those, and you've heard a presentation from Louise and colleagues that developed this survey, we're sort of wondering how we might sort of wind down our activity or transform it. Louise gave some suggestions about where she would like to see this survey going forward. And and one of those applications is obviously discussions with organizations that are interested in serving the research community they support. And I will ask some specific questions of each of you, but perhaps I'd just like to ask you to give yourselves a brief introduction aside from those hats that I've invited you here to give us a sense of who you are, where you sit, and what your potential interest is, or what you've heard today, which you find intriguing. So maybe I'll turn to Matthew first.
Sure. Thanks, David. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. In the last few days at various meetings, I've been cutting in and out mid-sentence, so hopefully I will stay with you. So my name is Matthew Lucas. I'm the Executive Director within the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And as David mentioned, I'm one of two co-chairs of the Funders Forum. And for those of you that don't know, the Funders Forum is a group of research and research infrastructure funders that meet usually the day before the start of an RDA plenary to discuss data issues with the RDA Secretariat and Council and amongst themselves. And this year we were really pleased to have David and Louise present to us some of the work of this group. And although I think the group might have been a little sleepy by the time you got to speak to them, David, given the wide range of time we're dealing with a global meeting like this, I think you definitely, your presentation was quite intriguing. And I'll say a bit more about that later on, but there's a lot of interest in understanding what the current situation is with data management, with data sharing, the tools and various things that researchers and institutions find useful.
Thank you, Matthew. Demetrius?
Yeah, thank you, David. So apart from my RDA hat on as a tab member, my day-to-day life, I'm executive director of a European research infrastructure that brings together 121 museums, mainly from the natural history. I'm also a CIO of one of them, located in the Netherlands, Naturalis Biodiversity Center. I have to say that I will be contributing mainly with my hat on as a RDA member here, and I'm really interested to partake in this discussion regarding the future of the IG. I'm also trying to understand the two different facets that I think, at least two different facets of the work that you've been introducing within RDA. One from the point of view of the more systematic research approach on how you survey surveys, basically, and the other one from how this group can be providing or has provided some substantial guidelines and useful outputs for the rest of us within the RDA ecosystem. And I think this is where, in between those questions that you posed, David, in terms of the future of this IG will lie on.
Wonderful. Thank you, Demetrius. Seppo. Unmute yourself.
Hi, David. Yes, I almost forgot to do that. Thanks a lot, David, and good afternoon, morning, colleagues, depending on where you are. So as introduced, my name is Seppo Hashigonta. I'm the Director for Strategic Partnerships at the National Research Foundation, which is a public funding agency in South Africa. And besides that as well, I'm interim manager for the African Open Science Platform, which is as well aligned to some of our mandate and drive as African agenda on open science. Besides that, of course, my interest is to look at how we can connect the dots from the African institutional perspective aligned to so many initiatives we're doing in the continent, most of them actually being partnered with IDRC and our many colleagues in the continent. So it's more of the African-driven agenda, working with partners beyond Africa. So that's my main interest, as well as how the survey that's being conducted now can be taken up or linked to already existing initiatives, especially with regards to the funding perspective, research perspective, the policy angle, etc. So I'm quite excited to this discussion and the way forward. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Seppo. If I could turn to Matthew. Louise and I, we joined the Funders Forum meeting, which brings together a number of research funders and other organizations in RDA to give a sense of our work and potential applications to their day-to-day jobs. I originally got interested in this interest group that stemmed from a Global Research Council meeting in Ottawa in 2017, when a number of a breakout group of about 15 heads of funding agencies across the world commented on the evolution of their research data management plans and practices within their organizations and other policies they were using to support the infrastructure. And they said it would be a great idea to come back in several years and get a sense of how things have moved, how the needle has moved in our work. And so it was with this that when I heard the work that Ingeborg and colleagues were thinking, I thought, well, survey data is a real powerful instrument, particularly if you've got a broad group of individuals who are within your community to understand trends over time. And so it was with that interest that sort of got me motivated, really, to join this and see what we could bring together. So I know you don't speak for the funders that are in your Funders Forum, Matthew, but we also are aware that a number of countries are beginning to roll out national surveys to really take the pulse of what's happening in country and how changes are going at time and what the obstacles are. And the survey that both other surveys and the instrument that Louise is doing provide a potential instrument to sort of get a better comparative view of this. So do you have any observations on us as a group, how we might move forward from an interest group more either into a working group or into other forums?
Well, you said it very well that funders are interested both in the current state of things, understanding the baseline, so to speak, and then as they roll out new policies or create new requirements, they want to see how those policy requirements, incentives they create impact the environment. And so it's both the getting a sense of what exists now and then how that changes over time, measuring the evolution and hopefully getting a sense of the impact of things. So I think I mean, both within a country, I think what you're doing is extremely helpful. The creation of a database of questions that a funder such as SSHRC, which is the acronym that the organization I work with, can use, is extremely valuable, not being an expert in surveys myself or having much expertise at our organization for that. And then the ability to compare data across organizations and across countries. David, you well know that we have the 3 federal granting agencies, or the 3 typical federal granting agencies, and it's challenging enough to develop data that we can compare across the 3 of us. So this is very helpful in that regard, but then also the ability to understand how different interventions that we are making, the impact that might have compared to some of the interventions that might be being made in other countries, and some of the supports that exist there, and also some of the different practices. Just to put on my very local hat for a minute, we've often felt that there are some local characteristics to the way social science in particular is being carried out in Canada that may be quite different from some of the work that's going on in Europe, and understanding the dynamics of how researchers are sharing data is important to help us understand how our researchers are playing on that global field. And we know that international collaboration it goes without saying, it's a key part of research these days. But if the data sharing practices are quite different in different countries, that can create a challenge to a seamless collaboration, and can create different obstacles that can come up when those partners need to talk. So understanding any differences that might exist is quite useful. And we're interested both from the individual researcher point of view, but also from the institutional point of view. The new policy that we're leading on for the granting agencies in Canada, one of the requirements is that institutions create a public strategy for how they're going to support data management. We're not telling them what that strategy has to have, or we're not requiring anything particular in that strategy. But that requirement means it's important for us to understand from an institutional perspective as well some of the challenges that they face. I'm just thinking about from the incentivizing responses to surveys. I know one of the surveys that was run in Canada by Portage, which is a third-party organization doing a lot of work on data management, was the fact that the agencies were coming out with a new policy. And this was an opportunity for institutions to respond to a survey in ways that might help us develop a more effective policy. So reaching out to researchers and saying, look, this survey may help the funding agencies target interventions or develop policies that meet you where you are, as opposed to some image we may have of where they are, I would hope would also be a small part of the incentivization.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Do you think we should come back to that funders forum group with a?
I do, and I think it would be really helpful to come back with maybe even with a more concrete look at here's the database of questions that we've done. Here's some areas that we've used them. Here's where we've had an opportunity to do some comparative look at some different places that have instituted these. I think that would really spark the interest, because of course the real challenge is just getting people to pay attention and getting people to take it up, and that's the challenge of all the RDA outputs, right? And so finding funders too that may be first movers and will use this, that can then you can then use to display the advantage or usefulness of your work, I think would be really helpful. So I would also focus on that, trying to identify some people that could use this in a very practical way now. We could then come back and talk about maybe at the next RDA.
Thank you, Matthew. I think that provides a nice sort of segue, because to Seppo, if I can turn to you, in part because the survey that Louise and colleagues are doing is situated in Africa. You introduced your role in the African Open Science Platform. I'd be interested to know, if that initiative, bringing together governments, funders, researchers on the continent on this, whether an instrument like this, where you see scope for application, or what we might do sort of moving forward.
Thanks a lot, David. And of course, definitely there's lots of synergies if you look at what's being done, as well as if you look at the mission of the African Open Science Platform, which is not new per se. And my colleagues working on that survey have also been heavily involved in the African Open Science Platform, which basically tries to put African scientists at the cutting edge of science, as well as data-intensive science. So there's a lot of alignment, number one. Number two, as well, it builds on what we're already doing within the continent, as I said earlier on, with regards to issues around building institutions' capacity in the continent at the different levels. If you look at funding perspective, as we are doing through the Science Granting Council initiative, looking at the university perspective, where we want to start creating that platform where universities are enabled to start sharing this data and come up with all those enablers, like different policies, of course, at the national level, as well as infrastructure to support all these data sharing practices. And at the core of it as well is aligned to the discussion now when we speak of partnerships and networks. That's very, very critical at all levels. If you speak from the Standards Forum, as well as even the research perspective as well. And how do you do that? It also links into the issues around trust. The question that you asked around incentives, it's a sword, it's a double sharp sword. So you have to look at what incentives, if you've got the capacity as a funder to look at incentives. Of course, it's not always monetary, but as well as looking at other ways of looking at it in terms of building trust within different communities, building trust of the science that's being funded to society, as well building trust of the funding that we provide from the funders' perspective which is public funding, to the researchers and etc. And everything being said as well in terms of, if you look at the survey is always critical because you need to look at the baseline. That's within the context of the data itself in policies and etc. So if you don't have that baseline, it's always difficult to build on other incentives with regards to the funding or instruments that are able to be put forward. So I see lots of alignment, not just within the survey itself, but what it brings up with regards to increasing the sharing of data, as well as institutional linkage, the relationship that is going to build as the survey is happening, for instance, through the relationships within the continent, IGRC, Funders Forum, etc. So there's those underlying things that will come out of the survey that will add value going forward. But at the bottom line as well, it's the need to connect as well, connect all these dots with regards to where does the survey outcomes plug in the existing initiatives, or if they're new initiatives, how do we find those synergies for optimal impact?
Thank you, Seppo. There was just hearing you speak, there was an excellent presentation at Botswana by Paolo Budrone, who was involved in a survey in Austria, and they rolled this out in part just to get a sense of what the research community wanted and where they wanted to move, and use the survey as a tool to hold national conversations at an institutional level, but also at a national level around what was the infrastructure, what was the services that needed to build and support researchers. So it's not only in an evaluative sense that these are being used, but also help to inform the design of policies, which I thought was quite a clever application. Dimitris, I'm going to turn to you, and the reason why you asked you is not only as our tab supervisor, but also just kind of speak about RDA more generally. When we wrote our case charter, we didn't include RDA as a user group, but in the time that we have been active, there have been a number of other interest groups within RDA that have approached us about housing the data, surveys they've been doing, and trying to get a sense of what their community or their questions are doing. When we've looked at the range of surveys that are out there, there is a wealth of information that are beginning to look at trends that I think are germane to almost the entire RDA community. So as our sort of interest group kind of winds down, I'm wondering any suggestions you have on how RDA might keep abreast of some of these trends that are being reported out there, and how the other forms of support that other IGs or working groups have that are tracking data through surveys within our working groups, so that we can begin to have, I guess, a collective record of what it is that we're looking at, what the data is sharing, and making that more widely available. So we are an interest group, and I guess it's our responsibility to share that with other interest groups. But how does RDA as an alliance make these connections? And if our interest group winds down, are there ways in which we might make some recommendations to RDA to help sort of capture this data and trends over time? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh God, yeah, David. I think you're touching upon a very important and very challenging aspect of RDA. I think let me start by saying that all the groups that somehow their work pertains across the multiple other communities and groups within RDA have usually the most challenging, but in everyone's opinion, I think, at least within the core of RDA, the most impactful potentially role. And what we want to see is that horizontal link between all the communities that come in and are growing as from the bottom up within RDA. As you know, RDA is a space where basically any community of any size can find a house to accommodate for their discussions and open up a window of communication. So your question says to me, you're asking, okay, how can some of the outputs that we have already produced find their way into the ears of a multitude of groups across the community? I would say the first challenge is usually to produce an output that is simple enough and tangible enough and understandable enough for a series of different groups that probably do not have the breadth or depth of your understanding of the topic. So what we've seen up to now is that outputs that really approach issues from a very simple but possibly very impactful way are those outputs that find their way into, you know, in the ears of many people across the community. And usually this works also as a hook for establishing these communications or on a bilateral level or as a sub-community. So, but let me also say something else. I mean, when I remember still the discussions that we had with Ingeborg back when you put in the case and we were discussing it in the tab, and then I was trying to figure out what exactly are you trying to do. I have to admit that in the beginning it was quite difficult for me to understand how this fits. And but when the discussion through with Ingeborg gave me to understand that this potentially can be a very important group for RDA for two reasons. Not only for from the point of view of the research that you're doing around all these aspects that you presented about the interoperability of the different surveys and the outputs of the survey. By the way, I really enjoyed Thomas's intervention talking about how we need to interpret data in the context and how similarly within the outputs of surveys like these, we need to maintain that context and be able to interpret those results from the surveys within the right context. And that's a very important thing. So I don't know if you as a community within RDA feel that you have made a circle and you have completed the circle and you feel that you have discussed whatever you had to discuss. But bear in mind that IGs, interest groups within RDA, were not really designed to have necessarily an ending point. So we're not looking for necessarily for communities that find a closure through a certain group of outputs. You can continue operating and discussing and being a community within RDA that really try to or adapt to agendas or reconfigures basically their way of operation. But on the other side, in terms of as a service to the rest of the RDA community, I mean, you very nicely have talked now with Matthew and on how the Funders Forum could potentially benefit from some of those outputs. But I would argue that I would see similarly a lot of these discussions taking place with many of the community-driven groups within RDA. I mean, I've been involved in RDA from the beginning, mainly in the beginning representing the biodiversity community, and I would say that within the biodiversity community, we similarly have these issues on how we embark on, interpret, and make interoperable some of the surveys, and how we benefit from results of the surveys, or how we allow ourselves to rely on outputs that other surveys have produced. And I think what you are discussing in this group is all about that. So I would like to see, personally, with my RDA hat on, I think there is still a lot of way here to establish more and more connections and leverage some of the outputs that you have already established. So just don't consider the fact that you have produced some outputs as the ending point. In fact, for me, is a starting point. Because if we really want to see the transformation or contributing to some transformation within the wider RDA community, I would say that this is also your role. And RDA, in terms of the coordination mechanisms or the supporting mechanisms, and that includes TAB, have very limited say in that. The only thing we can do is support you in this process or bring you in contact, but it's very rare that we will take ownership of implementing or even disseminating to an extent, if you know what I mean. So I think it's it's a community's responsibility still to see how the outputs find their way into implementation potentially across all of those other groups that operate within RDA.
Excellent. Thank you, Dimitris. Those are very good. And I think within our group, I just respond quickly, and then I'm going to turn to Matthew. Matthew managed to find the raise hand. So folks, anybody else that can find that button and would like to ask a question, I am going to turn it over. We're going to have an open discussion. My only point my colleagues and I were raising is as an interest group, the questions we set out to look at are more or less have come full circle. We set out to, except perhaps build a community, but we could be at that for quite some time. But in terms of identifying the challenges and developing some tools, we thought that either it transforms into like a working group or something else, and that it is an interest group. Would we really just be here to provide a voice for individuals who want to bring explanations of how the trends in open data have changed and to what effect on an ongoing basis. But I think the work of our charter more or less has been come full circle. So we're going to have a debrief after this session with our group. We'll engage you in that. I think you gave us some great ideas about how to move forward. Matthew, can I?
Absolutely. I just had a quick question in terms of the outputs of this group. Is it the intention to develop the bank of questions as an official RDA output, or is it already an official RDA output? Because that stamp of approval, so to speak, is meaningful, and RDA has done a lot to generate the trust in that stamp of approval. And I think it would be very useful if we were able to say, here's a series of survey questions that has been given the stamp of approval from RDA for use at various levels, whether it's national funding agency or regional or an institutional survey. And here's a series of sort of metadata related questions we would encourage everyone to ask to enable some comparability across the data. And then here's some other questions that that are available for use if you wish. I mean, that's a very practical, tangible output that would be of quite a bit of benefit to funders, institutions. It may be a bit well, no, and I think it would as if there was also a way of then tying back and asking groups that use that information if there was a way of allowing access to some de-identified a data set or something like that. That could be really interesting if you were able to then start generating some data you could do some comparisons on. Yeah, just some quick thoughts.
Great, thank you, Matthew. We hadn't thought as a group this idea of as an official sort of output. I guess we will take that forward. I have seen those moving forward. Dimitris.
Yeah, I would like also to give a few more because you mentioned the working group as a continuation form of this group, but I would like to highlight the fact that the working group is actually a much more restrictive way of operating within RDA. It has a maximum of 18 months duration, and in that duration, the group is mandated to provide basically as much as possible of the outputs that they promised to provide. And after that, the group usually ends almost automatically. So, or it goes into a maintenance mode, as we say. So the question, I think, to you all as members of this group or interested parties is to consider whether you feel that your expertise and your point of view and your perspective as a community has a space within RDA. So I would like you to think above and beyond the necessity of producing outputs and think about this as a space of operation where you have the opportunity to interact with a multitude of different communities that potentially can give you feedback, or you can provide some feedback to them. So please don't think the interest group as something that has necessarily to produce outputs. It's extremely important, don't get me wrong, and it's always very welcome, but that's not the purpose of the interest group. The purpose of an interest group is to support the community to develop the network, to allow the horizontal cross-fertilization between different other communities that really bring their own challenges and issues within RDA. And I think you, by you, of course, I mean the group, bring a very interesting perspective and quite different perspective that is, we all somehow rely on those surveys, but we very rarely actually handle them in a with the level of let's say reflection that we should in either developing them or interpreting them. So I think you definitely bring a very unique aspect, and I think that's very well understood, but it's up to you to decide whether you want to continue this space or not.
Thank you, Dimitris. Colleagues, we've monopolized the conversation, and I do want to, let anyone else who's listening to this conversation to chime in, give your perspective, some recommendations. Just unmute yourself and join. Well, I'm going to just share my screen here to give you a sense of. So in the shared document, you'll find, sorry, in our shared tools, there's a link in our chat, a draft document that we put. It's basically, we're calling it our reflections and recommendations. It gives us a bit of an aim of our group, some of the main messages that we've, through our consultations and past meetings, have come to, and a little bit more of a deeper dive into some of the insights and links to previous presentations. So this gives us a bit of a summary of our work to date. And then at the end are some of our thoughts about moving forward. So I'll briefly go over these with you, and if there's any reactions to those, you can either voice them here or you can go into the document and make some comments, and we are going to make this as a public document. So one of our observations or recommendations for survey designers is, if those who have an instrument at play that they're wanting to trace data over time, we're not coming in and saying you must change it to a different model. But to the extent that you can promote comparability with other surveys, utilize standards or evolving standards that are happening, they should do so. And along with publishing the data, we're looking for some additional background information in the repositories to help give meaning and context and why they asked the questions they did. We're also asked a nudge to the output in this group to utilize the survey bank and contribute to it. For survey sponsors, and these are organizations that are either RDA member groups or funders or national agencies or publishers, we're looking to consult both the survey, get a sense of is this tool useful for them, in the view of that creating some baseline comparable data we think is pretty powerful. And to continue along the line of reinventing the wheel is not going to help my agency very well in understanding how, in the countries where we fund research, to get a sense of pulling on multiple data sets to get a sense of what the community's interests are and how their perceptions towards supporting open data. We're encouraging agencies that have established national strategies and a monitoring and evaluation plan to assess their influence of their policies and openly publish these results. And I think this is perhaps an opportunity for a future RDA group that will help to demonstrate empirically what are the changes in practices and why those have come about. Dimitris, what we asked, we have a number here for RDA, but we might revisit these in light of your comments. But a uniting interest of the RDA community is to improve the policy and infrastructure that supports data sharing and data-driven research. And we think that the number of the surveys that are out there do provide a lens to look at these issues. We're looking for opportunities within the other RDA interest groups to utilize our service, but we also wanted to give a note, and you've answered this question, that other RDA interest groups and working groups are doing surveys and trying to get a handle of this and bring it into a body of knowledge. I think is something that bears sort of exploring a bit further. How that's done, I think you've given us some suggestions on that. And one of them, I'm not sure if this is a standing committee, but those who are organizing plenaries to keep an eye on this landscape, because on an annual basis or semi-annual basis, there are some very large findings that give a broad picture of the changing landscape. And that might be of a bit broader interest to the RDA, but also those organizing plenaries. So this is a document that's available. We'd like your comments. You can go right in there, add your questions. If you think if you like them, you can put a star. If you think they're unreasonable, tell us likewise. So thank you I thought I would end with that overview of that document. If there's any other comments that people have, we'd like to hear from you.
Hi, here's Marcus. So there's a sort of a chat going on in your open document, and the question is, or I would like to see in the future that the data, the results of the questionnaires collected from the different subsets of the questionnaire could be collected in a centralized pool of information where you could make larger surveys out of it. This could be a fantastic source of information, and it could be feasible as the questions themselves have been translated one-to-one. I think this might be a good and feasible thing to do.
And do you have any suggestion, Marcus, on where that might be or how we might do that?
No, it's a question coming to my mind as I'm part of the Helmholtz metadata collaboration in Germany, and we're setting up a similar survey, and we've just identified your work as a very important source for our project, so for our survey, and it might be nice to connect the pools of information resulting from the surveys, and then have larger comparability.
Excellent. Okay, well, you've got our contact. I've written down your name. We can follow up after this session, and I'm sure my colleagues will be interested in sharing their views with you. Is there any other, sorry, we're reached our time here, folks. So thank you for joining us. If there are any other questions, I'm happy to stay on board, but thank you for your participation.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, David, and everyone else. Bye-bye.
Thank you, David. Thanks. Bye.
Okay, great.